Well, I am happy to be back, and thank you so much for coming to listen to what I have to say today. So, I come from Columbus, Ohio, and I'm president and founder of Wellness Forum Health, and our company specializes in informed medical decision-making. It's a practice specialty that we invented. And I'll tell you what that means. What that means is that consumers should buy healthcare the way they buy everything else. I want you to think about this for a minute. When you go to buy a car, what do? You check out online, you do a lot, you ask friends, you look up warranties, you do some research, right? In fact, I've been in business for 22 years, and I've never had somebody pull up in a new car into my parking lot, and I said, boy, you got a new car. Yeah, I hate it, but it's the salesman told me I had to drive it, right? And how do you buy houses? I mean, do you just basically let the realtor choose? Do you say something like, you're so much smarter than I am about real estate, so you just pick out a house for me and tell me where to show. And I don't need to read those mortgage documents. I mean, that stuff's crazy. You guys know more than I do. Just tell me where I'm going to be living. You know, people invest more energy in researching before they buy a blender than before they have major surgery. And this is a problem, because when I'm open every afternoon for practice, here's what I hear all the time. If I had known then what I know now, I never would have, and you can fill in the blank, all right? So our business is helping people to look at the evidence, filtering everything through a stated evidence filter. We have 23 criteria by which we evaluate evidence, and then people can look at diets, supplements, screening tests, diagnostic tests, drugs, and procedures, and decide on their own what's best for them. And I tell people every day, doing informed decision-making isn't doing what I say, even if you think I have better ideas. It's doing what you think is right after you've looked at the evidence. How many people think that that would lead to better health care? And people would be happier about their choices if they knew what they were doing, all right? So that's basically what we do. And what we want to get people away from is, if I knew then what I knew now. And I'll tell you this very interesting thing about informed medical decision-making. It leads to a place that I think everybody here would like to see more of. People decide to adopt a plant-based diet. And I'll tell you why. When somebody has cardiovascular disease, coronary artery disease, we go right to the drug company's website and show them Crestor will reduce your risk of a heart attack or stroke by 1.2%. Do you think most people know that? They don't. Well, you know this diet starts to look really, really good, the plant-based diet, when you know that some of the drugs and procedures are not as effective as you might have thought. So basically today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about autoimmune diseases and their causes. It isn't just diet, some other things too, but you have to change your diet if you're going to recover or stop the progression of these diseases. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. One thing I'll mention, paring this down was very difficult for me. I teach a course through our school on autoimmune diseases that includes 24 hours of lectures and another 15 or 20 hours of lab discussion, patient experience, et cetera. And so I had to condense that down into 90 minutes, which means that I will have to talk very quickly, all right? So anyway, let's go on ahead and get started. So the first thing is, like all diseases, the incidence of autoimmune diseases is increasing, not decreasing. 8% of Americans have been diagnosed with at least one of them. 250,000 new cases every year. And one of the things that is the most distressing to me is the number of children who are being diagnosed with autoimmune disease. The average age of diagnosis is going down. There are over 100 autoimmune diseases, but 97% of those that are diagnosed are one of these here. The immune system, just the definition of autoimmune, is when your immune system no longer has the ability to tell the difference between bacteria, viruses, and your own cells. So the body, the immune system malfunctions and becomes interested in your pancreas or your liver or your thyroid gland or your joints. Multiple autoimmune diseases are very common. In fact, one of the things I tell people who consult with me is that our first goal is to stabilize you so that the one you have doesn't get worse, and maybe we can even reverse it. But the most important thing is to make sure that, for example, if you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, you don't end up being a hypothyroid patient who also has type 1 diabetes. If an autoimmune patient lives long enough, he or she will almost certainly develop more autoimmune diseases. So what are the causes? And we're going to talk a little bit about all of these. One is genetic susceptibility, but it's not as strong as you might think. Hormones and hormonal fluctuations. It's the reason why women develop most autoimmune diseases. 78% of all diagnoses are in women. Diet is right up there with the top causes: leaky gut, chronic infections, chronic inflammation, asthma and allergies, overweight, obesity, and vaccinations. So if we look at genetics, genetics is the favorite thing to blame diseases on. And the reason I don't like this is, first of all, the evidence doesn't support it. But just as important, I think if you think that genes determine your health outcomes, it puts you in a pretty helpless situation. Because I don't know about you guys, but I didn't get to pick my genes. So if you think that it's all about genetics, there's really not much you can do about it. But if you understand the real causes, you'll have a lot more power over what happens to your health future. Less than 10% of people who are genetically susceptible to developing autoimmune diseases actually develop them. The risk changes over time. It changes when people move to different locations. There are a lot of migration studies published where you can see the health outcomes for people who live in an area where a particular disease or several diseases, the rate's very low, and then they move to someplace like the United States, and within about 15 years now, it used to be a generation, now about 15 years, you see the same incidence of disease once people adopt a Western diet. Another thing that we see, and it's very diet related, is that if you do challenges where you take certain things out of the diet, people get better. When they start eating them again, they get worse. And I'll show you some of those before we're finished here. Now, just to give you an idea on the genetics, this is a chart that will be hard for you to see, but I'll tell you what it says. What we have is a few autoimmune diseases, and we have the population frequency and then the sibling risk, all right? So if you look at this, most of them, the sibling risk is very low. So for example, psoriasis is the top one. 2.8% of the population has it. The sibling risk is 17%. But if you look at ulcerative colitis, less than 10%, 1/10 of 1% of the population has it, and only 1.2% of siblings get it. So it becomes very crystal clear. And we even have some studies with identical twins showing that the disease concordance is not very high, even in identical twins. So a lot of what this is all about is not your genes, it's about other things that affect your life. So let's talk about hormones. Androgens, or male hormones, are more immunosuppressive than estrogens, and we think that that's one of the reasons why females have more autoimmune disease than men. Testosterone has been shown to suppress antibody production in patients who have lupus, for example. Rheumatoid arthritis patients have low androgen levels, so there's a clear hormone connection. Looking at hormones, a higher lifetime exposure to estrogen increases the risk. So what we see is that earlier age of menarche is an issue. Women who take supplemental hormones, either in the case of birth control pills or oral contraceptives, and also a hormone replacement therapy after menopause, increase the risk. And women who have conditions that are related to abnormal or irregular hormone production. So women who have even PMS, infertility, heavy menstrual periods, things of that nature, PCOS, always at higher risk of autoimmune disease. One interesting thing is that changes in hormone status due to things like pregnancy and menopause change the risk. So for some diseases, when women get pregnant, the diseases go into remission, and then after delivery, they get worse. Sometimes the diseases get worse. One of my most interesting patients was a woman who had managed to keep her ulcerative colitis in remission by having 14 children. And it was a good short-term strategy, but this, menopause happens and we can't keep having babies, so now we have to actually address the underlying cause of the disease. So that was a pretty creative thing to do. I'm not sure I would have been willing to do it. You got to give her credit for effort, right? But anyway, we see that both pregnancy and menopause, depending on the disease, make the conditions worse or better. Allergies are a major trigger, and by the very definition, what allergies are abnormal immune response. This is when your immune system starts to misbehave, and instead of being interested in bacteria and viruses, it's interested in pollen and dust and animal dander. And so we take allergies very seriously in my office because we often see that allergies are the first sign of an immune system that's misbehaving. And if you don't get those allergies under control, and there are a lot of things that you can do in reference to diet and probiotics and things of that nature to calm down allergies and asthma so that this doesn't progress. In fact, one comment I can make in general about health, regardless of what condition somebody has, is part of what's wrong with medicine is that it's all about giving you drugs or supplements or procedures or something to kill the symptoms, so that you don't think you're sick, or to deal with biomarkers. But the problem is you don't get to the underlying cause, which means the person continues to get sick. And so that's one of the reasons why by the time people are in their 60s and 70s, they're taking so many drugs. The original thing that went wrong when they were 42 or 35 or whatever never got fixed. So I always liken it, I teach through analogy, if I drive home from the airport on Sunday and the oil light comes on in my car, there are a number of ways I can address it, and one of them is to pull over to the side of the road, pop the hood, and disconnect the fuse that lights up the oil lamp and keep driving. Okay, that's called taking drugs, that's called taking supplements, because we know the end of the story, the engine's going to blow up. My office is full every afternoon with people where the engine's blowing up, and now we really have to pay attention. So I don't want people to be ridiculous about every symptom, because you can go the other direction too. My elbow hurts, do I have bone cancer? I've got hangnails, does that mean something terrible is wrong? But I find too many times people ignore the fact that their body is starting to give them clear signs that they're deteriorating, and they ignore it and just keep marching along. So allergies are a trigger. And if you take a look at the biomarkers for allergy, which include things like inflammatory cells, mast cells, antibodies, T cells, cytokines, these are all the same immune cells that are involved in autoimmune. And so it is a natural progression from allergies to autoimmune, and frequently when we see autoimmune patients, they have had allergies for a long time, sometimes since childhood. All right, so I'll give you some dietary triggers, and one of them is iodine. We are always told, and this is another common theme in diet, health, and medicine, that you need more of everything, right? And you see this, that's where the supplement business has capitalized. If a little bit of calcium is good for you, then 10 times as much must be fabulous, right? And if a little bit of protein is good for you, well, eating 35 times as much as anybody should eat, that's got to be better. So one of the things that's happened is that people are convinced that they're not taking in enough iodine every day. And so they often consume supplements that contain iodine. In fact, a lot of doctors who I think are not very competent take patients who are showing signs of hypothyroidism and put them on iodine supplements, which ultimately blows out their thyroid. And we see in areas of the world where iodized salt is introduced, one of the first things that happens is within a very short period of time, the incidence of hypothyroidism starts to go up, exactly the opposite of what people have been told. The average person in the United States takes in about 1.5 times the amount of iodine needed daily, and then starts taking supplements and drops and all that sort of thing. Bad idea, actually, for a variety of reasons. Another thing is gluten and autoimmune diseases. It's a common trigger, and it's particularly common with thyroid disease. And I will show you the mechanism of action in just a little bit here. I want to make something perfectly clear, because I'll be talking a little bit about gluten tomorrow. There are people who have celiac disease. They need to avoid gluten. There are people who have something called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and we have a good body of evidence showing that there are some people who have that. That is a very small percentage of the population. We have a lot of people who've tried to make this into something entirely different, where everybody's being told that they're allergic to gluten and shouldn't eat gluten. That's not true. One of the things that it has done, this craziness, is it has made a great market of gluten-free products so that our celiac patients and autoimmune patients actually have something good to eat, because the options used to be terrible when I first started 22 years ago. But there is a trigger, there is a connection, and I'll show you quite a few studies that show a connection between gluten and many types of autoimmune disease. Dairy and animal foods cause chronic intestinal inflammation. And this leads to a condition called leaky gut, which we're going to talk about for just a couple seconds. And what this does is this allows the entry into the bloodstream of partially digested proteins. And so we'll talk about how that leads to autoimmune disease. But we have animal studies and we have human studies showing that this is one of the main triggers of autoimmune disease. So let's talk a little bit about leaky gut, and just to tell you what it is. So your intestines are where nutrients are absorbed. And there's a huge carpet of bacteria called your gut microbiome, which is the fashionable thing to talk about these days, and that's a good thing, actually. In fact, your microbiome is made up of about 100 trillion cells, bacteria cells. That's more than you have in your whole body. Your whole body is 37 trillion. So we're going to talk about this more tomorrow. But where leaky gut comes in is that carpet of bacteria. They serve several functions. The first thing is they help you to absorb nutrients from food. They control your immune system. It's the signaling center for your immune system. And also, they help you absorb nutrients from food. So there are a variety of different ways, which I'll show you in a minute, including eating animal foods, that damage that microbiome. And what happens is these tight junctions that drag nutrients into the bloodstream become loose, and partially digested food fragments start getting into the bloodstream, along with bacteria, toxins, and a lot of other things you don't want circulating through your bloodstream too. And what happens is they're targeted by the immune system, which is the right thing to do. Anytime there's something in your bloodstream that doesn't belong there, you're counting on your immune system to trigger a response. So antibodies are created for what we call these antigens. Ongoing exposure, which is bound to happen if the leaky gut condition continues, means more and more antibodies created. And so what you end up with is food sensitivities such as gluten, dairy, that sort of thing. The development of autoimmune disease following the development of leaky gut is well known, well proven, but it's not right after. And we were having an interesting discussion before you and I in the front row, before I got up here, about the fact that you can injure yourself for a really long time with a bad diet and not know that it's going on. In fact, I have only one suggestion for an improvement on the human body by design, and I think Dr. Esselstyn would like this. I think it would be great if the interior of our blood vessels had nerve endings. And so what would happen is you would eat like really high-fat meals, and you'd be in excruciating pain. Like you'd be on the floor in the fetal position in your kitchen. You would not do it again, all right? So the fact that you can injure your blood vessels literally for years and years and not know anything going on or feel anything going on until one day you have a stroke or heart attack, that's why you have to look at this from an intellectual standpoint, and you can't afford to say, well, I've been eating this way for a long time and nothing's wrong with me, so it must be okay. Well, it's okay right now, but it may not be okay next week if you have a heart attack or a stroke, right? Okay, so what causes leaky gut? Well, meat and dairy does. Drinking too much alcohol does. And unfortunately, we still have health professionals who are promoting alcohol as having health benefits. It doesn't have health benefits. It's at best a treat. Now, if you have, like me, if you have 6 glasses of wine a year, I don't think you're going to do a lot of damage to yourself, but I have people in my office who have 3 glasses of wine every night, and you're doing a lot of damage to yourself, all right? So alcohol is a treat. It's way at the top of our food pyramid. It's not for daily consumption. Antibiotics are a big one. One broad-spectrum antibiotic can wipe out your gut microbiome in just 10, 12 days, all right? And we prescribe way too many antibiotics in this country. Now, we know doctors tend to overprescribe, but we have to take a little bit of responsibility as patients, because a lot of the doctors I talk to say, listen, I know I shouldn't prescribe so many, but patients get mad when I won't give them to them, all right? So we have to educate people not to ask for them. But what happens when you take antibiotics is they wipe out the bacteria that might kill you, or you might be able to recover without the use of antibiotics in many cases. That's a different discussion for a different day. But they wipe out your beneficial bacteria, and they cause the pathogenic bacteria to flourish. And we'll talk about that more tomorrow. Cow's milk intolerance, and you notice how many studies I have? I have probably 2,000 studies archived on my server about diet and autoimmune disease. Again, I'm condensing down. We could have 25 slides just on cow's milk and autoimmune. In fact, cow's milk is just kind of bad for anything that you don't want to get. And somebody asked me, I gave a lecture the other night about diet and health, and she said, is there anything that cow's milk is good for? I said, you know what it's really good for? Growing breast cancer. If you want to grow yourself some breast cancer, you want to get some cow's milk products and eat them every day, because that's one of the quickest ways you can get there. Patients with inflammatory arthritis. more likely to have intestinal inflammation and leaky gut. So we've looked at some of the causes. Elevated levels of antibodies to gut bacteria and to food have been found in people with inflammatory arthritis. And so this is one of the things that happens as part of this abnormal immune response. The way that, and just a preview of tomorrow, your body and your immune system should know the difference between you and not you, your pancreas versus viruses and bacteria. Also, your immune system is intelligent enough to know that the bacteria in your gut are not you, but they're supposed to be there. And so what happens with autoimmune is as inflammation levels get higher and higher as a result of doing some of the wrong things that we've talked about, the gut bacteria start being targeted too. Remember, they're the signaling system for your immune system. This is real bad for business. So let's talk about molecular mimicry. And what this is the amino acid chain of one protein closely resembles the amino acid chain of another protein. They don't have to be identical. They just have to resemble each other closely. So the way that your body works is you produce antibodies for any antigen, foreign thing, that gets into your bloodstream. And if the amino acid chains that make up those partially digested food fragments look like the amino acid chains that make up tissues of the body, we call that molecular mimicry, and that can be the beginning of your immune system starting to attack your own body. So let's look at cow's milk proteins. They're very similar to the amino acid chains that make up the collagen in human joints. And so as you get a leaky gut from eating poorly or taking antibiotics, however it happens, drinking alcohol, now you've got partially digested food proteins getting into the bloodstream, sometimes cow's milk if you consume those cow's milk proteins. Antibodies are created for those, and then those amino acid chains on the cow's milk protein look like collagen in the joints. Now you've got the beginning of rheumatoid arthritis. The same thing is true with gluten proteins and the tissues of the thyroid, that type of reactivity. So let's talk about type 1 diabetes. These cow's milk proteins not only look like the amino acid chains not only look like the collagen in the joints, but they look like the beta cells, the amino acid chains that make up the beta cells that produce insulin in the body. So here's a typical thing that can happen to a child who drinks cow's milk. Cow's milk proteins, or cow's milk was never intended for humans. Some kids don't digest cow's milk very well. In fact, most people don't digest cow's milk very well, but little kids in particular, that's why they should have formula. So one of the common responses to this is kids get infections, ear infections. Ear infections and tubes in the ears are sort of like a passage of childhood. I mean, it's just like so normal. I hear friends talking about it all the time. It's like, oh, you know, my granddaughter had the tubes put in her ears last Thursday, like everybody does it, right? Well, everybody shouldn't be doing it, is my point. So anyway, what happens, these kids get ear infections, they take antibiotics, that leads to a leaky gut. Now cow's milk proteins are getting into the bloodstream, the body starts to create antibodies to those cow's milk proteins and then goes after the beta cells of the pancreas. So how do we know that? Well, in 1992, a study was done. Blood samples were taken from 142 type 1 diabetic children, and compared to controls, 100% of the kids who were diabetic had antibodies to cow's milk protein in their bloodstream. None of the controls did. So that's a pretty good sign. And it's been confirmed by other studies. In fact, I think I've read all of the studies on this topic, and I can only find one that did not show this result. And by the way, just so you know, there are no issues where all studies 100% point in the same direction, which is why things can get so confusing, which is why it's important to have an evidence filter so that you start sorting out like the preponderance of the evidence and that sort of thing. So that's one thing. Genetically susceptible children who are weaned early, fed cow's milk formulas, and have leaky guts are more likely to develop juvenile diabetes. One U.S. study showed that children of this profile who consume cow's milk have 11.3 times greater risk of developing juvenile diabetes. That's actually higher than the risk that a smoker will develop lung cancer, if it gives you an idea. Now, we don't always know who the genetically susceptible children are, so we're just feeding cow's milk to infants and waiting to see what happens, which I don't think is such a great idea. I think if parents saw this type of information, it would cool the enthusiasm for formula. I've gotten kind of not so nice about that anymore. I had somebody the other day tell me that breastfeeding is inconvenient. And I said, well, I think if you were looking for convenience, this having children thing, bad idea. There's nothing convenient about having children, all right? You've got 18 plus years of inconvenience coming up if you do this right. The breastfeeding is such a tiny, tiny part of this, right? So anyway, this is what informed decision-making looks like. A lot of people get angry with women because they don't breastfeed, but nobody's showing women the outcomes that happen as a result of not breastfeeding. So anyway, the risk factors for type 1 diabetes are early exposure to cow's milk proteins and formula, short duration or no breastfeeding, antibiotic treatment, high birth rate, weight, and rapid weight gain. Obesity and weight gain, even in infants, is a risk factor. So let's talk about inflammation. Chronic inflammation can come from a number of places, particularly diet, and being overweight or obese, allergy, asthma, infections. And so what happens when you're in a chronic state of inflammation is the immune system is switched on. And in some people, this eventually switches on an autoimmune response. So you can be genetically predisposed and not do the things that we're talking about and not get an autoimmune disease. That's me. Every single female in my family on my mother's side had rheumatoid arthritis by the age of 50. I'm 61 and I don't have it. My sister does, and she's 4 years younger than I am. So I'm an overachiever, and I know that if I wanted to eat my way into rheumatoid arthritis, I could do it. All I have to do is start eating like my sister and my mother and my grandma. I could very quickly put myself in that situation probably by Christmas of next year, but I'm choosing not to do it. On the other hand, you can have no genetic susceptibility, and if you have enough of this type of thing going on, you can end up with autoimmune disease. And another thing I'll say about inflammation and diet, just for a second, is that arachidonic acid is concentrated in animal foods, and it's a precursor to inflammatory hormones called prostaglandins, series 2 prostaglandins. And so people who eat a high animal foods diet almost end up in a chronic state of inflammation just every time they eat a meal. It's an argument for really reducing or eliminating animal food. All right, a couple of other causes. The hygiene hypothesis. You know, I think it's great that we're a lot more clean than we used to be. I mean, we used to have sewage running down the street. Bad idea. I get that. But we are trying to prevent anybody from having a childhood illness. We're trying to use antibacterial soap on our skin. I took a 3-hour CME course one evening on the microbiome of the skin and how dangerous it is to wipe it out by using antibacterial soap all the time. All right, so we really live in a very clean environment, too clean actually. And then another issue is antibiotics related to this. This raises serious questions regarding our current overuse of antibiotics as well as ultra-hygienic environments that many of us live in. If the bacteria within us are specific to us and necessary for normal immune system function, then it's important to know if we're in fact losing those vital bacteria. So, and we are, by the way. Martin Blaser wrote a great book called Missing Microbes. He's studied the microbiome a lot. His wife is also engaged in the same type of research, and she went to Venezuela and found a population of people that have very little interaction with the outside world. And they took fecal samples from these people and found 300 bacteria that are missing from the human microbiome in places like the United States. We don't know what that means yet, but I can't believe it's really a good idea for this to happen, right? We'll bring up a controversial topic. I'm told I'm controversial, and I've thought about that a lot. You know, really basically what I do is tell the truth, and I want to know when did telling the truth become controversial. I'm not sure I understand that, but in any case, I'm not afraid of controversy because I can back up what I say with evidence. But the most common autoimmune diseases reported post-vaccination are lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory myopathies, multiple sclerosis, Guillain-Barré, and vasculitis. And just to give you an idea, there's a long track record of this. In 1976, the National Influenza Immunization Program began. It started with 1 million vaccinations a week, went up to 4 million a week. Within 2 months, more than 10 states have reported Guillain-Barré outbreaks in vaccinated people. So back in the days when we were a little more responsible about it, in December of 1976, this program came to a quick end. By January of 1977, more than 500 cases of GBS were reported. Some patients recovered completely, some partially, 25 of them died. So the program determined that the risk of acquiring GBS within 6 weeks of vaccinations was 10 times higher than the population that did not have the vaccine. So, of course, the definition of insanity is you do the same thing again and again and hope for different results. So we tried it again in 1992, 93, and 94, and we had exactly the same thing. And now we mandate that healthcare workers get vaccinations as a condition of working in a hospital or medical institution, because that makes a lot of sense based on what I'm telling you, right? Mass inoculation was instituted in the U.S. for the swine flu. 45 million Americans were vaccinated. That was back in 2009. The estimated risk of GBS prior to vaccines, 1 in 100,000. The incidence was 7.6 times higher within 5 weeks. Vaccine adverse events reporting system acknowledged the risk was higher. And there's this huge disconnect, by the way. If you actually read the drug companies' data, the FDA website, the CDC website, they tell you all about this, but it gets totally sanitized from the public information about vaccinations. Links have been established between the DPT vaccine and autoimmune, measles and multiple sclerosis, MMR and hepatitis B and rheumatoid arthritis, and Gardasil and GBS. Gardasil is one of the most interesting ones right now. There's a lawsuit. A colleague of mine by the name of Peter Goethe, the co-founder of Cochrane Collaboration, has filed a lawsuit against the European Medicines Agency for fraud, scientific misconduct and fraud pertaining to the Gardasil vaccine. Japan has taken it off of the schedule and has opened 31 centers to help the injured women and girls from this vaccine. So other countries are starting to get a little aggressive, at least with that one, in terms of addressing the situation. I could put up, I have about 4 or 5 hours of lectures just on the vaccine autoimmune connection, but these studies I think are important. I'm just going to read you the results of one. Systemic autoimmunity appears to be the inevitable consequence of overstimulating the host's immune system by repeated immunization with antigen to the levels that surpass the system's self-organized criticality. And what that means is that anything that perturbs the immune system abnormally can eventually result in the immune system being switched on and it's unable to switch itself off. So just to kind of bring us up to date, just to tie all this together, think about it. Taking antibiotics wipes out your gut bacteria. Now things can get into the bloodstream that shouldn't get in. You can end up having allergies as a result, asthma as a result. You can have autoimmune disease as a result because your body keeps pumping out antibodies. That destruction really damages the signaling system. And so what happens is the immune system ends up switched on, constant antibodies going through the system. The way I explain it again through analogies, it's like street gangs wandering around in downtown Melville looking for mischief. Your antibodies looking for stuff to do, and they find it. They start attacking tissues of the body. So a similar thing that you could do is if you went home tonight and you flipped your furnace on and off and on and off and on and off and on, if you did that for 4 or 5 hours, you just might switch the thing on and you can't switch it off anymore. And the next thing you know, your house is 140 degrees. That's sort of what people are doing with their immune systems in this way. So there are problems with confirming associations. One of the reasons is vaccine dogma. I mean, you just have a public health approach to this that says it's the sacred cow, you can't touch it. We offer a 25 or 30-hour course just in looking at the science on these issues because the medical journals actually do provide a great deal of evidence that what we're doing is a bad idea. But certainly the reason I'm telling you about it is that I see a lot of autoimmune patients change their diet. They watch Forks Over Knives or something of that nature and they change their diet. They definitely get better. But they don't get better enough, and one of the reasons is they're still showing up every year for their flu vaccine. And so every time you're perturbing that immune system, so it's really important to look at this as a cohesive picture. And again, I'm going to show you a ton of studies with diet, but if you take care of the diet and the woman is still having irregular menstrual periods or taking HRT for menopause, and having a flu vaccine, you're really not going to get very far. You have to take care of all of these causes that I'm talking about here. All right, so the typical approach to autoimmune is to treatment with drugs. Well, my gosh, it's the typical approach to everything, right? We have a drug for that. We have a drug for things that aren't even diseases. Like, I love those commercials, that the questions they ask people. Do you feel shy at a party when there's 500 people you don't know? Who answers no to that question, right? Okay, so anyway, steroids are one of the biggest class of drugs that are prescribed. And they're immunosuppressant, but they're not limited to suppressing the immune system as it pertains to the specific autoimmune response. For example, for just rheumatoid arthritis, they suppress the immune system, period. And for a very long time, we thought in medicine that the problem with steroids was if you took them for too long. So everybody would try to give small doses, short periods of time. We actually now have a lot of evidence, and I've written a couple of articles on this, showing that the first pill that goes in the mouth, you have problems. Some of the side effects of steroids are glaucoma, fluid retention, increased blood pressure, mood swings, weight gain, clouding of the lens in one or both eyes, cataracts, high blood sugar, which can trigger or worsen diabetes, increased risk of infections, thinning bones, suppressed adrenal gland hormone production, thin skin, easy bruising, and slower wound healing. Inhaled corticosteroids and topical steroids, equally dangerous. And the worst thing you can do is inject steroids into a joint, which is very common practice to relieve pain, because it almost, if you do it even once, you can increase your risk of having to have the joint replaced later on. I think this is an interesting study here. One dangerous paradox in arthritis treatment is that drugs most commonly used to treat arthritis are toxins to the intestinal barrier. All commonly used non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, apart from aspirin and Relafin, are associated with increased intestinal permeability in men. And so the drugs that are often given to people to reduce their pain and discomfort increase the likelihood that another autoimmune disease will develop, or that the one the people have will get worse because they damage the intestines. In fact, there's a lot of evidence. I don't teach a class in our school or to patients or give a lecture talking about anything where I don't end up talking about the side effects of NSAIDs and how they increase the risk. I think personally the drugs never should have been approved, and they should not be available without prescription. They certainly should not be taken every day, which is how they're advertised on TV. Very bad idea. While there are many causes of autoimmune disease, diet is right up there. So let's take a look at, and this may be hard for you to see. We call this the informed food pyramid. And just real quickly, I'll start at the bottom, 64 ounces of water. And that, what did we lose? Okay, well, anyway, 64 ounces of water. And that is regardless of whether or not you eat a plant-based diet. And the reason is it's pretty easy to take in a couple cups of water from food, but a human loses 10 cups of water a day, all right, through perspiration, feces, urine, sweating. And sweating doesn't mean that you have to be like at the gym working out. I mean, I'm sweating right now talking, and so are all of you. It's imperceptible, but you do sweat. And that 8 ounces has to, or that those 8 glasses have to come from somewhere. We have some really good studies showing that dehydration increases the risk of a lot of diseases, including heart attacks and stroke, because the blood becomes more viscous. Then you'll see starchy foods come next. Potatoes, squashes, whole grains, legumes, root vegetables, those kinds of foods. Next you'll see steamed vegetables, raw vegetables, any way you want to eat vegetables, and then fruit. And then you'll see cereals and breads and moderately processed foods, low processed to moderately processed foods. I don't think we're probably going to get people to stop eating all processed foods. It's very difficult. We don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. I heard some of the Q&A during the last lecture, and people were asking about nuts. Here's our rule with nuts and avocados and things of this nature. Provided you don't have serious coronary artery disease, I think it's okay to have some of this stuff, but the best way to do this, because I've learned from 22 years in this business, people don't really do well with less, more, moderate. I mean, does anybody know what less is, more is? In fact, I read 3 research studies that looked at this, what does moderation mean? And you know what they determined? That based on the responses they got from people, the definition of moderation is how much of something I really like I want to eat right now, okay? Well, you're not going to get very far if that's how you're choosing your foods, right? Because I'll tell you what, the most dangerous, I'm standing over here because the ice cream's over there, all right? So it's very tempting to just walk off the stage and get some, right? So the point is we try to stay away from that kind of language, which is not very prescriptive, and instead we recommend that people eat nuts or avocados. when they're in a dish or part of a recipe. So I'll give you a couple of examples. If I go to a restaurant, for example, and order a black bean wrap and it has some avocado in it, okay. What I don't do is buy avocados at the store and bring them home and look for things to eat them with, all right? Avocado toast, let me just put this in perspective. 1 cup of avocado has 21 grams of fat. Okay, so I could be twice this size if I ate a lot of this stuff. And it's not about counting calories, it's about having some concept of calorie density and how fat promoting some of these high fat foods are. If I make a vegan macaroni and cheese dish and it takes a 1/4 cup of cashews and it's for 8 servings, that's okay. Taking home the bag of cashews, insert hand in bag, not so good. All right, so we allow people to have these foods, but we give them some really prescriptive information about how to do it. And I think that's the way diet should be taught, by the way. I've written quite a bit about this, and we own the term prescriptive communication as it pertains to diet. And what I mean by this is when you go to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription, you don't get something and read the label. It says, take some pills, not too many. Right? It says take 1 3 times a day with food, and then people are really diligent about doing it. I think you have to have the same type of prescriptive communication. It's one of the things I appreciate about Dr. Esselstyn. He's very specific with his patients. There's no wiggle room there, and they know exactly what to do, and that's why some of them live. That's why they all live if they're compliant. All right, so above the nuts and avocados and seeds, we have, and notice there's no oil out to the side. Oil, and let me tell you the problem with oil. This is it. 120 calories per tablespoon and 14 grams of fat per tablespoon. All right, so let me put that in perspective, okay? If I were to add an oil-based salad dressing to one of my salads a day, all right, and that's all I did. Didn't change anything else. And I don't know what else I'm going to change. I eat a pretty perfect diet, and I exercise almost every day. I would weigh 37 pounds next year this day. 37 pounds. That's a lot, all right? So no oils. And then you'll see animal foods. What's that? Well, I'll come to that. That's barley, rye, oats, and wheat. It addresses the gluten issue. So I'll get to that in a minute. And then you'll see animal foods are optional, 2 to 3 times a week, no dairy, wild caught, or organic. We don't take it off the table for most people, but we have to limit that, more prescriptive communication. You'll see at the top treats, and treats are for special occasions. So again, I don't think we're going to get people who are 40 years old to promise they're never going to eat another cookie. They'll never have a piece of cake. One of the most common cognitive distortions for people who have trouble with eating patterns and drinking and drugs and a lot of things is perfectionistic thinking. All right, it's one of the leading causes of depression. So it's a bad way to approach this for most people. So treats are for holidays and birthdays. So now people will say, well, what about National Kidney Donor Week? Is that a holiday? No, we're not talking. We're talking about your birthday, and maybe your mom's, right? Christmas, Valentine's Day. But the reason I'm busy all the time is because people are treating themselves 14 times a day. And sometimes they don't even realize that the foods that they're eating are treats. So that's the basic plan, and then we'll talk about some of the specifics in the research. I mean, we could spend 2 or 3 hours just talking about that, and I'm sure you guys will have some questions about it. Now, as we start looking into research on autoimmune diseases, or really most diseases, one of the unfortunate things is we don't have a Dr. Esselstyn of the autoimmune disease business. I'm hoping sometime we get that kind of data, but it's really, when you put Dr. Esselstyn's data in front of a patient who has coronary artery disease, somebody who's had a heart attack, it's incredibly convincing. Everybody agree? And it's so easy for them to see. We have to do a lot more digging and connect the dots. Now, it's there in the research, in the medical research, so I'm going to share some of that with you. The biggest limitation in terms of research is that there's so much reductionism in research as it pertains to diet. So you deal with a lot of self-reported data from patients, and let's eliminate this food, one food. Well, it's the dietary pattern that makes the difference. It isn't, and it's unfortunate because the way that this is all talked about and communicated to patients is they read an article that says, blueberries reduce your risk of cancer, right? And everybody eats blueberries every day, and at the end of 6 weeks they get tired of blueberries and their health hasn't changed because there aren't enough blueberries on the planet to overcome the dietary indiscretions that a lot of people practice on a daily basis, right? So it's the totality of the diet, but you just don't see those kinds of studies. So back to inflammation and diet. The choice of healthy sources of carbohydrate, fat, and protein, along with regular physical activity and avoidance of smoking, is critical to fight the war against chronic disease. Western dietary patterns warm up inflammation, while prudent dietary patterns cool it down. Animal foods increase inflammation, and vegetarians and near-vegetarians have lower blood levels of arachidonic acid, which is a precursor to inflammation. So eating a more plant-centered diet. Now, I would love to have a Dr. Esselstyn type study to show you. I don't. What I can do is just overwhelm you with the number of studies that lead to our conclusions here. A raw vegan diet, including lactobacilli-rich and chlorophyll-rich drinks, resulted in improvement of symptoms for rheumatoid arthritis patients. An elimination diet reduced RA symptoms. Lower-fat diets reduced the onset of autoimmune disease in experimental mice. So you see this all the time. Raw vegan diet for a period of time, lowering the fat, but you start to get a clear picture if you put all these things together, not necessarily the raw vegan diet, because I don't think that's real sustainable over a long period of time, but the low fat, higher fiber, more plants, less animal. In this study, 24 out of 72 rheumatoid arthritis patients improved on an exclusion diet. So you might say, well, that's not very many. Well, remember, this is an exclusion diet where patients are self-reporting, but look at what they were reporting. 14 patients responded to grains as a trigger. Milk, 4 people. Nuts, 8 people. Beef, 4 people. Cheese, 7 people. Eggs, 5 people. 1 each to chicken, fish, potato, and liver. Now, the study would have been entirely different if they put all those people on a starch-based, plant-based diet for a while. You would see a different result. That's what we see in our office every day. 71 patients with rheumatoid arthritis showed improvement after 2 weeks when pulses, cereals, milk, and non-vegetarian protein foods were eliminated. Very low-fat diet resulted in complete remission in 6 patients with rheumatoid arthritis. Symptoms returned within 24 to 72 hours after eating a high-fat meal with foods like chicken, cheese, safflower oil, or coconut oil. In other words, you can make progress and undo it with one animal foods-based meal. All right, particularly if it contains high fat and dairy. The authors concluded dietary fats and amounts normally eaten in the American diet cause the inflammatory joint changes seen in rheumatoid arthritis. 46 adults with rheumatoid arthritis eliminated dairy products and cereals. 36, or 78%, responded, 17 clearly improved. 19 were in complete remission for 1 to 5 years. 8 of those were able to stop all medications. Now, to put that into perspective, with autoimmune disease, drugs can give you a very short period of time. 5 years is sometimes a miracle. Diet alone is capable of producing that. Gluten intake is linked to Hashimoto's and Graves' disease, celiac disease, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, and leaky gut. Autoimmune patients should eliminate high gluten foods, and that's barley, rye, oats, and wheat. So that's where the brow comes from that you were asking about earlier. Now, some people say, well, oats don't contain gluten, and you're right about that. But a study that was done in Canada that sampled oats from all over North America concluded that 88% of the oat supply in North America is contaminated with enough gluten to cause a response in a celiac patient. So that's why we tell people to eat gluten-free oats. And we err on the side of caution because the people who come to us are pretty sick. So we think it's more important to err on the side of caution, and it's pretty easy to get gluten-free oats almost anywhere. So those are the 4 foods. They can eat any other grain that they want, and we distinguish between the person who has autoimmune disease and celiac, which is an autoimmune disease. But the celiac patient, the intolerance to gluten is so much that just a tiny drop of it in soy sauce is enough to flatten out the villi and cause the disease to progress. This is not the people who have autoimmune disease. They don't have to eat what we call a medically gluten-free diet. A study of patients with rheumatoid arthritis. Patients improved when diets were improved. Conditions worsened when the patients reverted back to their normal diet. Researchers stated that the improvement was due to the reduced intake of potential trigger foods, reduced gut permeability, weight loss, and lower production of inflammatory hormones. 7 out of 15 patients with rheumatoid arthritis went into remission when dairy was eliminated. A study looking at the relationship between cow's milk, egg protein, soy milk, and arthritis in experimental animals showed that there was no reactivity to the soy milk, a lot of reactivity to the cow's milk, the eggs. So again, animal food, cow's milk. In a 6-week placebo-controlled single-blinded study of 48 patients, 48 of them were able to identify foods that caused symptoms. Cereal foods such as corn and wheat produced symptoms in more than half. A follow-up study of 100 patients who had used dietary therapy during the previous 10 years showed that 1/3 were still taking no medication alone, on diet alone. The most common foods causing reactions, cereals and dairy. So again, you have to connect the dots here. But I have probably, as I mentioned, I've got a couple thousand studies archived on my server. And after you see study after study after study after study where the patients are saying, when I stop eating dairy, I get better. When I stop eating high gluten foods, I get better. That becomes difficult to ignore. And the absence of a long-term longitudinal study, I don't think can stop us from, or should stop us from acting on this. High intake of dietary fat damages the intestines, and that's what I was talking about earlier. A vegan diet changes the fecal microbial flora in rheumatoid arthritis patients. And that's why we have to have autoimmune patients take probiotics if they're going to get better. They will get better on diet alone, but they will not get all the way better most of the time if they don't restrict certain foods, eat a low-fat diet, take probiotics, avoid vaccinations, and do something, get their hormones under control if that's an issue. Fiber. And this is, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, but your beneficial bacteria love fiber. And if you eat enough fiber, your beneficial bacteria will produce all kinds of anti-inflammatory chemicals that help to keep your body in a low state of inflammation instead of a high state of inflammation, and also to protect the microbial environment in the intestine. Here are some studies on leaky gut and probiotics. They resolve leaky gut. And we have a lot of studies that show that. We have hundreds of them that show that. One of the reasons, by the way, if you're frustrated with doctors who don't know a lot about this, one of the reasons doctors don't know a lot about this is because most of the studies regarding probiotics were published after 2004. Well, my gosh, I was out of school by then. I was like the oldest person that ever went to naturopathic medical school. I graduated at 44. But most of us, when we were in school, there wasn't much of this research to look at. So it has contributed to problems with patients getting the right type of therapy. Then we have some specific studies I can show you. 45 adult men and women with symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis were randomly assigned to take probiotics or placebo once a day for 60 days in addition to their medications. There was greater improvement in the patients who took the probiotics. So you're not only healing up the gut with the probiotics, but you see a marked difference in inflammation levels, joint pain, stiffness, and that sort of thing within a few weeks of starting to take the probiotics. Sometimes we end up doing an elimination diet. Now, I'll tell you, this is probably one of the most interesting things that I've noticed or worked on in the last several years. So we have we do a complete whole person approach to this, where people restrict the brow foods and no dairy and low fat and eat a plant-based diet and don't get vaccinated and all that kind of stuff. And in all cases, people get better, but sometimes you have people that will say, I know something's clearly wrong because on some days it's a little worse than others. So we do an elimination diet where we restrict their intake to just a handful of foods. And then if they become asymptomatic on that very limited diet, we know it's a food trigger. And then we start having them introduce one food at a time. And what we found, which is very interesting, is that people talk about nightshades being bad for autoimmune patients. It's usually not nightshades, and even when it is, it's not all of them. And so I had one person who, when she eats bananas, it triggers her psoriasis to flare up again. Now, who would have thought bananas? Another one of my folks, corn did it. No other food. So the bottom line is that it's highly unpredictable. It's led to a lot of identifying triggers that we probably would not have paid much attention to. I never would have thought to tell a psoriasis patient to reduce their intake or avoid bananas. We wouldn't have found that out any other way. So that's what we can do if we still have symptoms that we need to get rid of. One thing that is an issue with autoimmune patients is that a lot of times they have comorbidities due to the drugs that they've taken, the other conditions they've developed, and so we have to work on those things too. Loss of bone mineral density is real common, which can be resolved with sunshine, making sure the GI tract is repaired. Exercise builds bones. You know, bone is living tissue. You get a new skeleton every year, but you got to stimulate that with movement, and we do have a very sedentary population. I mean, I don't know, I remember every time I talk about sedentary people, I remember that episode of Friends when Joey and Chandler got those black chairs. Does anybody remember that? And they sat in those chairs with the remotes and their phones, and they did not get up. They even had their pizzas delivered across the hall. and brought over so they wouldn't have to get up out of the chair, right? Well, we're not too far from that right now. I mean, I have people that avoid movement at all costs, and I used to do that. I used to put my garbage cans on the car and drive them to the street so I wouldn't have to move, right? Well, nobody told me not moving was a bad idea for the first 20 years of my adult life, but it's a very bad idea. So anyway, you can rebuild your bones if you're willing to do exercise. Flare-ups are usually a result of non-compliance on the diet or stress. But what happens is the flare-ups, which almost everybody has, they become less common, more space between them, less severe, until one day somebody wakes up and says, I can't remember the last time I had an episode. And then we know that we've really put the disease in remission. One thing that we do too with people, I don't know how many of you know about True North in California. They probably are going to name a building after me. I've sent a few hundred people out there because I love those people. They do a great job, and water-only fasting has been shown to be effective. And just so you know, the studies that I'm going to show you here, and I won't read them to you, it's just that people get better when they fast, and then they get worse when food is reintroduced, and it's not because you can't eat and have to fast for the rest of your life. It's because these studies show that people stop eating anything and fast. Guess what they do when they start eating again? They go back to eating dairy and high gluten foods and too much animal food. And, so going out to True North and fasting and then going back home and ordering a steak, not going to help you a whole lot, right? So you see, but the point I was trying to make is that none of these studies I'm showing you here were done by the people who own True North. All right, so this is all done by other people. So what we'll do many times for people who have had autoimmune disease for a long, long time is we'll get them on a health-promoting diet, which is, I think, better if you send somebody to fast after that, and then send them out to True North. And you see time after time, as these studies show, that people get better. And so that's become a staple recommendation for people who are in a position to do it. And it's actually not that expensive. Their rates are very, very low, less than the deductible if you're going to be on drugs and have procedures for the rest of your life because you have autoimmune disease. One thing that this study points out that I think is interesting is just fasting improves the permeability of the gut. Now, it doesn't mean you don't take probiotics, and Dr. Goldhammer at True North recommends them, but just fasting starts to allow the gut to heal. One reason, you're lowering the inflammation levels from eating all the bad stuff that you were eating that got you there in the first place. And then this is a typical example of patients who, patients who improve when they're fasting, and then they get worse when they start eating again. So we see that all the time. And I won't read these to you, but there is quite a bit of evidence out there. So see how many there are, right? And for all kinds of autoimmune diseases, we're talking about rheumatoid arthritis, et cetera. So, by the way, the one that you can't reverse is type 1 diabetes, whether you fast or whether you don't. All right, so the best thing to do is water-only fasting followed by a program of dietary excellence like the one that we've been talking about. Now, one thing I'll mention is I think that fasting should be done in a supervised environment because somebody should be checking every day. So I tell people don't try to fast for 2 weeks at home on your own. I don't think it's a very good idea, particularly if people are taking medications. They may have to come off of medications before they can fast, or the fasting itself may make the medication withdrawal have to happen. So that should be done with some supervision. So I'm a fan. And if you've never been out there, it's a wonderful place. They do your laundry, you have cable TV, they have lectures, you forget that you're not eating. Even though they're preparing food for the people that are being refed and the people who aren't fasting, it really doesn't bother you after a while. And most wonderful medical care, I think. I wish we had one in every single city. I think it would be terrific. Okay, so I just want to spend a little bit of time at the end here, and then we'll take questions on multiple sclerosis, which is a little bit of a different animal, but we have a little bit more research on the diet angle here. Multiple sclerosis, about 400,000 people in the United States have it. It's usually diagnosed between the ages of 20 and 40. Women are 3 times more likely to develop it than men. Again, almost every autoimmune disease we see basically the same thing. There are 2 types, relapsing remitting and primary progressive. Relapsing remitting means that you have an episode followed by a period of remission. And one of the things about this is that I think drugs get credit for a lot of what would have been spontaneous remissions for a period of time before the disease starts to progress again. So I think that makes the medical literature kind of confusing on the efficacy of drugs, although I'll show you some pretty good data on the efficacy of drugs. So it doesn't really matter how it starts. In other words, if it starts relapsing remitting, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be miserable at some point in time. At some point in time, almost every autoimmune disease, including MS, starts to progress. So what are the causes? Well, again, we have people who say we don't know. We have people that say it's genetics. Studies show that in areas of the world in which saturated fat consumption is higher, the incidence of MS is higher too, like the United States, Canada, and Europe. This relationship is even true within countries. Like in Norway, the diet is much lower fat at the coastal areas than it is internally, and you see a difference in the incidence of multiple sclerosis there. Cow's milk was found to be as predictive for cow's milk consumption for the development of MS as living in a northern altitude. And there is some element of molecular mimicry, which I talked to you about earlier. So Dr. Roy Swank was the grandfather of research on multiple sclerosis. This is his theory, and he proved it with a great deal of research, that sometimes MS begins in infancy. Formula-fed babies lay down a very poor foundation in the myelin that becomes more susceptible to injury. Later, a virus or a bad diet, lots of different things can happen that injure the nervous system, and these injuries are almost always near blood vessels, which caused Swank to believe that a diet that caused injury to the blood vessels might be a contributing factor to a neurological disease. According to several papers that Swank authored, and he authored quite a few, when people eat a diet high in saturated fat, the blood cells are coated and stick together. Then clumps form in every capillary. Oxygen tension in the blood vessels drops. This disturbs the blood-brain barrier, allowing substances access to the nervous system that would not normally cross the barrier. Antibodies to food proteins resulting from leaky gut attack the myelin. Swank concluded that MS was a result of the weakening of both the blood-brain barrier and the intestinal mucosa. In other words, he was talking about leaky gut a few decades before everybody else started talking about it. So here's one of his initial group of people. He took 144 patients from the Montreal Neurological Institute. They followed him for 34 years. He was sort of the Dr. Esselstyn of multiple sclerosis. The patients were placed on a low saturated fat diet, 1 to 15 grams a day. The progression of MS was stopped or reduced, reduced or stopped by the low saturated fat diet. The reduction in fat was effective even for those with advanced MS at the start of the study. The first year, there was a 70% reduction in what's called exacerbations, flares of the nervous system disorder. 5% per year after that, 95% total reduction. It remained constant for 16 years. And he reported that only 1 in 500 patients did not respond to dietary intervention. So we can say to a multiple sclerosis patient with a great deal of certainty that you are likely to benefit from changing your diet, highly likely to benefit from changing your diet. So here was a summary of what he found. 95% of patients consuming a low saturated fat diet remained normal or only mildly disabled at the end of 30 years, and only 5% died. 80% of the patients who continued to consume the high fat diet died. 80% versus 5%. That's a huge difference. He published a lot of additional studies documenting his success with over 5,000 patients, and other researchers have confirmed his work. Now, I mentioned this before, the drugs are incredibly ineffective for MS, and I think they get credit for the relapsing remitting pattern in the beginning. For example, interferon beta, which is a common drug, and by the way, why do I show you this? Because this is part of informed medical decision making. If you're having trouble getting patients to change their diet to a plant-based diet, show them what happens if they just take drugs. So among patients with relapsing remitting MS, administration of interferon beta was not associated with a reduction in progression of disability. The ultimate goal of treatment for MS is to prevent or delay long-term disability. Our findings bring into question the routine use of interferon beta drugs to achieve this goal in MS. So I'm going to show you something that it would be funny if it weren't so serious, all right? So the Multiple Sclerosis Risk Sharing Scheme was developed by the National Health Service in the UK in 2002. And what happened was that there was an interesting observation made, which was that patients who had no treatment, who had multiple sclerosis, were doing better than the patients with treatment. So the NHS managed to extract a promise from the drug companies that what they would do from now on is they would pay the drug companies based on how effective the drugs were. Does that sound fair? I think that's fair. All right. So that's what the plan was. So this went on for a little while, and patients basically taking the drugs were worse off than the patients who didn't take the drugs. And so the NHS said to the drug companies, well, you owe us money, because now we have all these people that have been harmed by your drugs, and it would have been better if we did nothing, so you're going to have to pay. Well, the drug companies refused to do it. And you could follow the story in the British Medical Journal for a good long time while they fought over what to do. And it never really did get resolved, but this was the conclusion, and I think this is important to read. Outcome-based schemes should probably be avoided if at all possible. In other words, if you're going to come up with this pesky evidence stuff that shows that what we're doing is a bad idea, maybe we just shouldn't look. Are you kidding me? Okay? But this is what happens when you start looking at the evidence. In fact, the Cochrane collaboration, which is one of the most independent medical research organizations on the planet, said that the use of the best drugs that we have available, which cost about $56,000 a year for the average MS patient, have absolutely no effect. And the same number of people will be disabled, wheelchair-bound, bed-bound, or dead at the end of any period of time you want to measure, whether they take drugs or take no drugs. Same thing. All right, so that makes a pretty compelling case for diet, don't you think? And it's surprising when you show this information to people how many MS patients say, give me the plants, okay? I totally understand what you're talking about. This is a path to nowhere. Eating the plants is the path I want to take. So the bottom line is that autoimmune diseases are usually a result of poor diet and lifestyle habits, which lead to things like high estrogen levels, leaky gut, molecular mimicry, chronic infections, chronic inflammation, allergies, asthma. And if you change those things, you can change the outcome. And most importantly, you can keep more autoimmune diseases from developing. I had somebody in my office 3 weeks ago who had 7 autoimmune diseases, 7 of them. The original one she had went back to when she was in grade school. Small patches of psoriasis, which people thought no big deal. Well, small patches of psoriasis turned into more psoriasis, which turned into rheumatoid arthritis, which turned into Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which turned into lupus, and it went on and on. All right, so we're in the process now of trying to fix that. I wish I'd had her a long time ago. All right, so that's my story. I'd be happy to take some questions about this. Yes, ma'am. My favorite part is the Q&A.
Thank you so much. This has been so informative. I have been seeing a lot of people, even at a young age, being, I guess, diagnosed with Crohn's disease.
That's my practice specialty, and we're going to talk about it tomorrow.
And
yeah, it's an autoimmune disease.
And they're 7 years old, and they're being prescribed Remicade for years.
Yep.
So I don't know if it's something I should wait on, or if
are you going to be here tomorrow? Yeah, because I'm going to talk about it. I have one that was born with Crohn's disease, taken to the hospital with a bloody diaper at 7 days old. So yeah, the age is coming down. I'll tell you more about that later. But yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You had small intestinal bacterial overgrowth on one of the slides. Can you make some comments about that?
It's just another way that gut bacteria end up where it's not supposed to be, and beneficial bacteria are wiped out. It's really not a separate disease. You treat it the same way that you treat the whole gut problem. You have to clean up the diet. You got to stop using antibiotics if you can. There are a lot of plant antimicrobials that you can use instead of antibiotics, and it's advisable to do that. And then start eating a good diet, and eventually you can clean up that problem. So people have turned it into a separate condition because there's more money in it, obviously, if you do that. But it's really not. Let's take somebody over here. There you go. And I'll move back from here, okay? We'll make sure we get some depth into this. Yes, ma'am.
Are there times when you have an acute inflammation and you try to do it on your own and it doesn't work, and you do take antibiotics, but the doctor says you have to take the full course? And I've not done that. When I start to feel better, I wait another day, and then
Yeah.
I figure my immune system will take over, and I try to help it.
The evidence is clear that you should not take the full dose. Everybody always said, and I've written articles about this, but the medical journals, several articles saying that, and particularly in this day and age. See, what's happening is is we're seeing now C. diff in community settings, MRSA in community settings. You don't have to go to a hospital to get C. diff or MRSA anymore. So this idea that you take the full course of antibiotics, most people don't need to do that. So yeah, you're doing the right thing. Okay, let's get somebody right over here. No, you were looking at, you who were turning around. We're going to do you next. There you go.
Hello, I was just wondering whether or not you have a similar study on chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, the same way you have for MS.
Chronic fatigue syndrome is interesting. It's often accompanied by irritable bowel, which is different from inflammatory bowel, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. Both of those conditions have a very strong psychological component, and often the patients will not get better. And I'm going to make some statements, and it may bother some of you, but I just kind of tell it like it is. One of the problems that you have with patients who have chronic fatigue and irritable bowel, but particularly chronic fatigue, is secondary gain. So people get to the place where it's better for them to be sick in their mind than it is for them to be well, which means that they're very resistant to the idea of getting well. So there was some discussion when Dr. Campbell was up here about psychological connections with illness, and it's a big one. And in almost every chronic fatigue patient I have worked with, what the pattern of behavior seems to be is extremely high overachieving type of people, mostly women, who at some point in time have some abrupt, they almost know when the line of demarcation is, when their health starts to decline. And they get to the place where they are completely non-functional. Now, I've seen men like this too, and they fall into the same profile. They then go to a lot of doctors, and part of the problem is that most of the advice they get is terrible. But even so, they don't get better, and they don't get any better in my office either, unless we deal with what is it that caused you to think that it was easier to be sick than it is to be healthy. And so this isn't a character defect. I want to make this very clear. In one case, I had a young man who was in my office with chronic fatigue, and after hearing the story of these overbearing parents who were pushing him to be an athletic superstar when the guy wanted to be a plumber or whatever, I would have gone to bed and not gotten up too. I'm serious. I understand where it came from, but you got to fix that, because what happens in the mind is that this black and white perfectionistic thinking thing steps in, where I have two choices: stay in bed or go back to that. Well, those aren't the only two choices, but when you have that type of cognitive distortion, you're not going to fix it until somebody helps you resolve it. So there are exceptions, obviously, to the rule, and there are some people who change their diets and get better, and chronic fatigue patients need to. But I've had quite a few vegan chronic fatigue patients who weren't any better from eating a vegan diet because the mental issue was not resolved. Okay? Yes, right there, yellow. Yeah.
When it comes to the probiotics, when I look at the probiotics aisle, there's refrigerated, not refrigerated,
Yeah.
50 billion, 150 billion.
You
How
need
do I know how much billions and refrigerated
Well, you got
not
to. You have to work with somebody. Most of the people, I would say probably 95% of the people coming in my office who take a probiotic are either taking something. They're usually taking something that can't possibly help them, either because it's such low potency they're on track to heal their gut by the year 2081, or it's got so much stuff in it that they're hurting themselves instead of helping themselves. And so we sell probiotics in our office, and the only reason we do, I tell people, I will give you instructions to go get one, or you can get them here. The advantage of getting them here is that we have them shipped just in time from the factory, that you don't have much degradation if you get them the next day and that sort of thing. So that's why we have them, but we are very specific about types. So you can go buy one on your own, you can get them from us, but you have to get the right, as you said, number of billion, the right strains, and then you have to step it up. In other words, the product you start with is not going to be the product you end up with. So we'll talk about that tomorrow with the GI stuff. We'll get into that a lot more. The refrigerated, not refrigerated doesn't make as much difference as the length of time between when they leave the factory and you put them in your mouth. Okay, a refrigerated product that's been on the shelves for 6 months is just as bad as one it's probably worse than a non-refrigerated product that you put that came from the factory 4 weeks ago. Okay. Let's go in the back over there. The guy with his hand up right there. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Popper. 2 questions. One, I heard you recommend or suggest True North for someone with type 1 diabetes. So for that individual, we have a friend that with True North followed by a whole food plant-based diet, how much would that help, number one? And number two, we have another friend who has, I believe it's called Mercer's disease, which I think is an autoimmune disease. How much would they benefit from a whole food plant-based diet, and do they need to consider gluten-free, do you think?
Any autoimmune patient, in my opinion, should have not gluten-free, but restricted and eliminating those brow foods. All of them, okay? All autoimmune patients. In terms of True North, I don't think True North will fast a type 1 diabetic because it's not safe. They can do juice fasting, but they have to eat. But having said that, accepting the type 1 diabetics, most autoimmune patients would benefit from fasting if they had the opportunity to do it. Having said that, also, we have many people who get well and never go fast. I mean, the vast majority of our people do not go fast, and they still experience health improvement. Okay, who's next? Let's do you next. I've got you right. You're getting your exercise today. It'd be nice if I just took them in a row, right? Yeah, well.
Hi. Hello. I have 2 quick questions. I always thought that you had enough probiotics in your gut if you ate a very good whole plant-based food diet. And the other one, I was just shocked. I had never heard that you could stop an antibiotic course midstream.
Yeah. Let's start with the diet. See, the issue with the microbiome is that these are not part of your body. These critters are renting space from you. They're renters, all right? And so this is like when people say, I'm going to eat well and hope to repopulate my gut, that's like saying my tenant moved out of the apartment building, I'm going to stand on the sidewalk and hope somebody shows up tomorrow morning living there. You got to go get a tenant, all right? So you have to, at a certain level of destruction, you have to replace. The appendix used to be the backup source. Like in the days when we used to get cholera and you'd have diarrhea, uncontrollable diarrhea. If you survived, you get some repopulation from the appendix, but we have an epidemic of appendices being taken out that shouldn't be taken out. And the level of antibiotic treatment is so horrific now that even that's being wiped out. So you're going to have to take the probiotics, okay? And your other question again?
I'm shocked. I've never heard that you can
the
stop
antibiotics.
an antibiotic.
Yeah, well, again, most medical practices don't follow the evidence, which is why it's so important to make informed decisions and do the research yourself. And so what we're trying to do, our end game, and we do it with all of the people who we work with, is that informed consent in the healthcare business usually means doctors tell you what to do, we call that informing, and you say okay, and we call that consenting. And then later on, you find out what the medical research shows really should be going on. So these articles that I've been reading for the last 10 years about the fact that it's not important to finish the whole regimen. But once something becomes a practice, one of the problems we have in medical training is that you have people who practice medicine teaching people who are going to practice medicine. Now, there's some good in that. But what also happens is a lot of bad habits get passed down from generation to generation. It's really hard to break the cycle, and that's why some of this stuff continues. Okay. I'm going to make it easy on you right next to her. There you go.
I have 2 questions, too, if you can answer both.
I'll try to remember the second one.
Right. The first one is that my mother, she's had a persistent itch in her ear for some time. It comes and goes, and she's gone to the ENT and to the allergist, and they haven't been able to help her get it better. So I'm thinking it might be something in her diet that's causing it.
It might be, or it may be that she's got some yeast in her ear that would be causing it. That could be something too. I mean, I don't know. It's hard for me to diagnose stuff from the stage, but
I should suggest her to go to to go to a nutritionist, I guess? Or
Well,
who
I
would-
think you have to
who
go to
would help
somebody
her
who
with-
knows something about this stuff. I mean,
Oh.
the flavor of the person is not as important as the evidence-based nature of what they do. And by the way, we were having a discussion earlier about this labeling. Okay, so people say, well, is what you do naturopathic? Well, I'm a recovering naturopath, just so you know. I try very hard to leave my training behind so I don't hurt people, all right? But so I think a lot of naturopathy is terrible. I think a lot of traditional medicine is terrible. I think what you have to do is say, we don't care where it comes from. We care what the evidence says about the particular thing that we're looking at. The same thing is true with the type of practitioner. I mean, I've met athletic trainers who know more about how to help people recover from musculoskeletal injuries than orthopedic doctors, right? So what you're looking for is people who are competent, and they're out there. I mean, we're there, you know. So you just want to get people who are competent and follow evidence, and interview them. You know, people interview babysitters. People interview people who walk their dogs, for crying out loud. Interview people who are going to do medical intervention with you. So what's your second question?
I wanted to ask you about what's your thoughts about vaccinating children
Well,
right now?
I don't have any thoughts about anything. This is an evidence-based discussion. Nobody should care what I think about anything. Okay, so let's just look at what the evidence says. And this is, again, a really controversial issue. And we're going to have a very robust talk about this at our fall conference in Columbus, because I invited Cheryl Atkinson to speak, who's done a lot. She's an investigative reporter, who's worked on this issue. Here's the problem with vaccinations. The first thing is we know they don't work. The flu vaccine efficacy rate is 10% this year. It is now clear there were 150 outbreaks of mumps reported by health departments, and so you know what the CDC says? We're going to have to give more boosters. Okay. Right now, whooping cough has been outbreaks in 49 states. They estimate that the vaccine lasts for a year. I mean, if we're going to use vaccines to prevent these diseases, eventually we're all going to be walking around with an IV drip bag, okay? The second thing is that the medical journals are quite clear. I wrote a 5 or 6 page article on tetanus. You know, the tetanus infection rate started dropping in 1870. So the vaccine didn't get introduced till 1947, and everybody says that we're preventing tetanus because of the vaccine. Well, that's clearly simply not true. And I'm not talking about third world country medical journals. I'm talking about the Journal of the American Medical Association, New England Journal of Medicine, et cetera. So these vaccines, number one, are not responsible for reduction in infectious disease for the most part. They don't work for the most part. And how many people know that there's a court that administers claims for vaccines? Okay, most of the people in the room don't. Most people who come to see me don't. So this is a great plan. A few decades ago, back, I think it was 1990, shortly before then, the federal government entered into an agreement with the vaccine companies to exempt them from any liability for the damage their products cause. And then they charge a tax on the vaccines, and it goes into a fund, and it's paid out through a court. Now, 99% of the people in this country don't know about this court, and everybody claims there's no problem, but they've paid out $3.4 billion in claims. That's a lot of money for a problem we claim not to have. And also, when most people don't know they can file a claim, it's the shortest statute of limitations of any court in the country. Now, I want to ask you this. How many people would want to buy a car if the federal government entered into an agreement with automobile manufacturers to hold them harmless from any damage their cars do? So if the brakes don't work, or they spin out of control, or whatever, or things blow up, then we just collect $250 tax per car and put it in a fund, and all the people who get hurt driving defective cars can file a claim. How many people would buy a car under those circumstances? So here's where I am on the issue. There's so much fraud and deception. When I tell you fraud and deception, you have no idea. That guy, Paul Offit, they put up there as the poster child, he owns a patent on a vaccine with Merck, and he was on the vaccine committee at the CDC that determined the schedule. I mean, this is criminal activity, in my opinion. So I think we have to stop this nonsense. Stop it. Do the right research, and then see if we're going to go forward. That's not, what are the odds it's going to happen? None. But that's what I think needs to be done. And I'll keep talking about it, and maybe we'll start a revolution and actually do it, you know? Yes, ma'am, right over here.
I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's about 12 years ago and was told that I have to stay on Synthroid for the rest of my life. Now, I'd like to get off. I don't know the best way to wean myself off. I know a plant-based diet will help, but do I stop this?
You may not be able to get off. Okay, it just depends on what your antibody levels were and what your health status is. And so when you start, I think it's very important not to promise things that you can't deliver. So when we start down the path with somebody like you, what we're going to do is we're going to do everything we can, first of all, to make sure you don't get another autoimmune disease, because if you're not doing all the right things, you're prone to get another one. Then what we'll do is see how far we get with that. And if we can reduce, that we can try some reductions in medication. But after 12 years, I can't say that you would be able to get off medication. You might not. But if it's a lower dose and you don't get more autoimmune diseases, we still win, right? Okay, yes, you here.
Can you say more about when you said chronic fatigue was psychological, and then you said the same thing with irritable bowel? Can you comment on the irritable bowel piece?
It's the same thing, and you see the same pattern. The people who have just irritable bowel usually stay functional, as in they're going to work and that sort of thing. But they, and again, I'm generalizing, there are exceptions to the rule, but the people with irritable bowel, they're still going to work and school and all that kind of thing, but they're always looking for the bathroom and talking about the limitations on what they can eat, and they stay home from work and they're sick, and it's a pattern. And just to be honest, my mother had this pattern. The only way my mother knew how to get attention was to be sick. And if you proposed anything that would actually get her well, she was highly resistant to that idea. Okay, particularly if it came from me. All right, so in case any of you are feeling bad because you haven't been able to convince your family and friends, I have not been able to convince my family and friends. My father, by the way, eats this diet and is 87 years old, takes no drugs. His IQ is higher than his cholesterol, so he listened. But the rest of the family, not so much. The rest of my friends, not so much. So anyway, okay, right here. Thank you so much for doing this.
Hi, I had asked before about this, but someone with lots of allergies and like esophagitis, depression, what would you say about that? He's got, like my son, he's got oral allergy syndrome, so he can't eat raw stuff, and so he's across the board with nuts and soy.
Well, we have to figure out what's causing it. You have to get to the root cause.
That's what I'm wondering. Like it's a
right. Well, and I don't know what the root cause is because I can't figure that out from here.
Right.
I'll say something about depression, and I'll talk about it in a general sense. So, just so you know, there is no such thing as a chemical imbalance in the brain that causes any psychological disorder. No such thing. The study that was used for the justified drugging 25% of the population was a study that was done on rats who appeared to be depressed. I've always wondered how you can tell if a rat is depressed. On autopsy, they ground up the brain and assayed the material and found out that the depressed rats were low in serotonin. Now that is, by the way, the only way we know how much serotonin is in your brain is to grind it up and assay the material, which we do not recommend, all right? Never sent anybody for that test ever in 22 years. Okay, so where this came from, one of my business partners is Dr. Peter Bregan in Ithaca, New York, the psychiatrist who never has drugged anybody in 50-some years. He's called the Conscience of Psychiatry because he started speaking out about this in the beginning. And essentially, psychiatrists had gotten themselves into a bit of a spot because of some of their terrible practices. I mean, these are the people that lobotomized one of the Kennedy kids and were doing electroshock in the mental institutions and making deals with prisoners to lobotomize them. If they would agree to it, they'd go free, but they lied about it. So they had lost a lot of their reputation, and they got the idea that if they could wear white coats and prescribe drugs like real doctors, then they could gain their prestige back, and the drug companies essentially accommodated them. The outcomes on the drugs are far worse. There is no chemical imbalance in the brain, but if you take the drugs, you'll end up with one, and that's all of them, ranging from ADHD to antipsychotics. Getting off of them is difficult. It's harder to stop taking Xanax than it is to stop taking heroin. So it has to be done very gradually. We got the first course approved through our school called Why and How to Withdraw from Psychiatric Drugs to teach practitioners how to take people off the drugs, because the psychiatry profession is pretty hostile to the idea in general. Don't let anybody drug you or your kids for psychological issues. What most psychological issues are is distorted thinking that has some origin in something that happened to people. And many people get in trouble. I mean, I've had periods of time in my life where I wasn't very happy about a lot of things. I didn't need drugs. I needed to talk to somebody. I needed time in the case of grieving over a death, something of that nature. So the answer is not drugging. And the problem we have right now, 25% of the people in the country take the drugs. It is the leading cause of disability. We put 850 adults and 250 children a day on disability due to these drugs. It's a financial behemoth this country can't afford. And so, yeah, we could talk a lot about that. I mean, I'll be around for the weekend so we can talk more. How do you find out what's causing it? You have to sit down and talk to somebody who has a clue. How you find it out is you got to sit down. How I find out is people submit history. People fill out a lot of forms when they come into my office. And we have a lot of discussion, and or by phone if it's not in my office, and we figure out what happened. I mean, unfortunately, right now, the 7-minute doctor visits, you give me a symptom and I'll give you a drug, or you go to the naturopath, you give me a symptom and I'll give you a supplement, has totally displaced the discussion about what happened to you. What happened to you? And when did it start? And you know something? People know a lot about their health. When I tell people, tell me the beginning of your story, and they almost know exactly the beginning of the story. A woman will sit in my office or we'll be on the phone and she'll say, you know, I started having irregular menstrual periods in college, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then these 7 things happened, and then, you know, here we are right today. So you have to start looking at what happened to the person, and then you can start to figure out how to fix what happened to the person. All right, so there are no shortcuts. I mean, you just have to do this work, and it takes time, and the medical system, as we've set it up right now, doesn't really allow much time for it, which is very unfortunate. So just one more thing. I think we're out of time for questions, but I am going to come over here, sign books. I'll talk to you for as long as you want to talk. I'll stay around after the panel discussion. I put out a newsletter on Monday that has an article about health. It's free. I put out video clips on Tuesdays and Thursdays, free. You can sign up when I'll put my sign-up sheet there. Feel free to sign up for the free stuff, and thank you so much for listening.